Hello guys, today I have one of those precious Zeiss Distagon 21mm f2.8 for the Contax Zeiss mount, which I will be servicing. It has extremely stiff focus, a little wet haze and dust in the front group, and a couple of other issues that I found out while servicing, including a little bent mount and a slight separation in one of the doublets. In order to work on these problems, I will have to disassemble this lens completely, clean up and apply new grease to the focusing helicoid, clean some of the optics and work on the bent mount. While at it, I will also perform some basic maintenance and cleaning. I will not be addressing the separated doublet in this lens since it's not in a form to affect the image in any way and its owner decided to skip the re-cementing for the time being. Before we diving into the servicing, here are a few facts about this lens. If you're not interested, you can of course skip to the servicing part. The Zeiss Distagon 21mm f2.8 for the Contax Zeiss mount is a legendary lens. It was introduced in 1994, which was a bit late in the Contax lineup. That also meant that it was a much more advanced and better performing design than Zeiss' other wide-angle lenses that have been around for decades. It was only made in Japan as an lens in two main batches, one in 1994 and one in 1997. It was then introduced as the now classic Distagon 21mm f2.8 ZE and ZF2 for Canon and Nikon mounts in late 2008. The design remained the same, with a slight recalculation on the back group, splitting a complex element into a doublet, just like the Distagon 28mm f2. The lens feels and performs very similarly to the Contax version. It's just a little sharper and with more contrast and saturation due to the upgraded coatings on the classics. The same design was also carried onto the Milvus lineup, making it the only lens that made it all the way from the Contax to the Milvus line. For Zeiss to trust the same design almost 30 years later and into an era that much more advanced designs are possible speaks of how well designed was the lens to begin with in the 90s. All versions of this lens have the same floating element design. The back group moves back and forth, enabling focusing, and the front and mid groups remain static in relation to the camera. This allowed for better performance in close focusing. When people make contact sets for filmmaking, they usually start with covering the most usual focal length, mainly 28 to 85mm. Then they realize they probably also need an ultra-wide lens to cover those wider shots, especially on Super 35 sensors. While the 25mm f2.8 is a relatively affordable, nice and fast enough lens, it doesn't offer that wider angle than the 28mm. The Distagon 18mm f4 lens is a great lens for its focal length, but a much older design from the Contax era and the distant 1967 that of course can't keep up with a lens designed almost 30 years later. The 21mm is also stopped faster, making it the most desirable choice to complete a Contax set at the wide end. This has driven the price up significantly, making it one of the most expensive Contax lenses, only surpassed by the f1.2's planar and some rare Contax telephoto lenses. The common problems that come up with this lens are the very stiff focus because of the hardened grease when the lens hasn't been serviced for a while, but most importantly separation in neither of the two doublets of the front group. This is one of the biggest problems with this lens, as it seems like the cement that was used for its manufacturing was not strong enough to last for many decades. Eventually, most of these doublets will separate without any particular cause and they will need proper re-cementing. It's something very common, so if you have one of those lenses, I highly recommend performing a proper inspection to see its current condition. Except examining the lens by shining through a strong flashlight and carefully looking from the other side, taking an image against the strong light source would likely reveal any separation problems by showing the characteristic rainbow glow around the strong light source. You can see the diagram of this lens with two cemented doublets at the mid group. The front and mid group are all part of the floating element, as they stay still while the back groups moves to achieve focus. The front and mid group can be taken out together simply by unscrewing them. Then the front group can be unscrewed from the mid group. The front group consists of 4 elements with a typical configuration for a wide-angle lens. The back group elements can all be removed in series from the back side. The elements around the iris are always the more susceptible to to Haze and dust, of course. As I have already mentioned, separated doublets in this lens are extremely common. Here's a little story of mine about this lens from some years ago when I was still not familiar with lens servicing and I haven't really developed an understanding of how to properly inspect a lens for common faults. I will just look at my lenses under a light or against the sun and they would look amazing, like brand new, without scratches and very clean inside. After all, they were described as top mint by their sellers, right? Through the years, as I started inspecting my lenses using strong flashlights, I started seeing more and more imperfections and I realized that either had really bad copies or most of the copies out there were actually not that perfect. Most of my lenses had tons of dust and I started discovering that many of my lenses had internal cleaning marks and little scratches or perhaps some form of light haze. My contact set at the time was made of my precious and only lenses that I have spent all my savings on. Like most people that begin making sets of vintage lenses for filmmaking, not understanding its importance to the image, my standards were too high and I got myself into an obsession for my lenses to look absolutely perfect. So I started spending any money I would make, rebuying the same lens, often finding some problem in the exact same elements or even some worse problems. I kept buying another copy, selling the old one at an honest price, spending a lot of money in the process. What I did find out though was that the lenses with the problems were not really any different in performance than the supposed good copies, and in fact many times they were even better. Having dealt with hundreds of lenses since, I slowly and painfully reached a level of understanding to know that the condition inside the lens doesn't necessarily reflect its performance. I also know for a fact from people that send me their lenses for servicing that most owners think their lenses are so mean and perfect because they look fine under standard light, but in fact most vintage lenses these days are far from perfect and have tons of little defects and imperfections. It's just they don't know how to inspect them in detail and if and how any of those imperfections actually affect the image. Most importantly, they don't understand how those imperfections make zero or placebo level difference to the lens performance. Unfortunately, when I got my first 21mm f2.8 Contax lens years ago, I was also of that mentality and I thought that every little thing affects quality. I would lose sleep over some little coating mark or dust particle in a lens. For that obsession I had to unfortunately pay a heavy price and that was my Contax 21mm lens. The story goes something like this. I've bought that lens locally at a relatively good price even by then standards. I was extremely happy that I finally had that great wide lens and I felt my set was really complete. The lens looked amazing and I couldn't wait for the next project to use it. With my then understanding, the lens looked really nice and clean inside. Meanwhile, next summer I went to Greece carrying all my lenses with me and went around taking photos and shooting some little projects. When I went back to Korea in autumn and while I was inspecting my lenses for no particular reason, I noticed a little mark on the corner of one of the deeper elements of my 21mm. After some researching, I concluded that mark was actually separation. At the time, and by reading terrifying stories online, I thought separation was the worst thing that could ever happen to a lens. I had no idea or way to know if that mark was there when I firstly bought the lens or something that happened during its use while on my trip in Greece. I checked all the pictures and videos I took since I got the lens and throughout the summer and I couldn't really find any problems with them. The images were really sharp, corner to corner, and the flaring was as expected. I took out the lens, taking some casual photos and videos, even comparing with the rest of my lenses, and I concluded there was no effect on the image, at least a meaningful one. In fact, I borrowed another copy of the lens from a friend and I could do direct comparisons. The image was perfect and identical in both lenses. There was no problem to be found in the image. I continued shooting with the lens, including some pretty big projects, and there was no problem with it. Being obsessed with my lenses being perfect though, I searched online and found somebody in the United States claiming decades of experience on Zeiss lens servicing, including recementing. So I decided to send my 21mm Contax so I have a perfect lens and I wouldn't have to worry about the separation getting any worse in the future. If you watched my video about the Contax 28mm f2, I also have a little story about my adventures with that lens and that particular technician. Those two lenses were sent in at the same time. After a few weeks, the technician told me that the recementing was a great success and the lens was as good as it can be. I paid about $600 $200 for the work on the 21, and I couldn't wait to receive my perfect lens back. When the lens arrived, it wasn't in the great state that I expected. It was very greasy, and the focusing that was supposed to be super smooth after the service was actually quite stiff. I have inspected the lens with a flashlight, and indeed the little mark on the doublet was gone. I got really excited for a few seconds, but the moment I've put the lens on the camera, I was shocked. The lens was performing so terribly that it was quite obvious even in the little screen of the camera. The in-focus was very unsharp and fuzzy, and the out-of-focus was full of chromatic aberrations and very milky. Even the worst of the worst wide-angle lenses of the 50s wouldn't perform that bad. I cleaned the front and back element carefully just in case, but nothing changed. This was now a defective lens. Like it was the case with the 28mm f2, the technician denied everything, told me that's how the lens was to begin with, threw some conspiracy theories to me about how people never sell a good lens and that Zeiss made some defective lenses from factory, and he bragged about how he has decades of experience and he's never wrong. Then he accused me of being some kind of scammer and offered me a bribe to never talk about this to anybody, which of course I never accepted. At the time, I had just moved to a new home and I was really stressed financially. Just to pay him the money for that work, I actually had to sell some of my filming gear, hoping I can buy them back later. I was extremely disappointed and frustrated with the result, and I couldn't emotionally deal with it. So I just sold the lens to somebody with an honest description and a very low as-is price, and I moved on. At that point, the lens was in theory repairable, so it wasn't such a bad deal. I just really didn't know anybody at the time that deals with re-cementing, and I was still thinking separation is such a huge deal and something impossible to do without precise and expensive equipment. Of course, I now understand that's not the case, since I have successfully re-cemented quite a few doublets myself. The new owner sent the lens to some very expensive and proud specialist who tried to separate the doublet in question and ended up cracking it completely. Although the lens was not mine anymore, I was so sad about it because just some months ago this was a perfectly working lens that I had shot some of my best photos and videos with. My obsession for having my lenses in perfect state was the reason for all this mess. At the time, the lens going price was almost $2,000, and if you add the extra $600 I paid for servicing it and the very small price I sold it for, the financial damage was quite big. This was a huge lesson to me and deepened my understanding about how to think about lenses a lot. Nowadays, I could easily save that lens. I can understand that technician not getting the cementing right, which resulted in the bad image. I don't understand though why those specialists that the new owner sent the lens to attempted to separate the doublet by heat and ended up cracking it. It's such an amateur mistake. Like they didn't really care about it and just wanted to get over with it. You see, no matter what the original technician has used for re-cementing the doublet, the element could be submerged into methylene chloride for a period of time depending on the cement, and it would eventually separate nicely and clearly to be re-cemented the correct way this time. That particular copy was recently sold to another guy who sent the lens to another technician hoping to find a fresh doublet to replace the broken one. Of course, that will never happen because any damaged Contax 21mm out there will actually have a problem with that particular doublet. The moral of the story: there is no god of servicing out there, and even the most experienced could do some mistakes. There are honest technicians, which I believe to be one of them, who would tell you, sorry, I did some damage to your lens while working and here is a compensation, or I replaced the damage from another copy, or offer some other solution. There are others that will make huge excuses and blame it on the condition of the lens, or even hide the damage from you, telling you that's how the lens was when you sent it in, or hoping you wouldn't notice. You don't have to be afraid, just make sure there is a good reason you're sending your expensive lens for servicing, especially if it already works perfectly well. But enough with the stories, let's get to the point. So I received this 21mm 2.8 lens for a completely servicing job. The first thing I did, of course, was to test the lens and compare it with other copies of this lens that I have serviced before, as well as my own. I found the lens to be very sharp and as expected in comparison with the other lenses, with no problems in flaring or bokeh. I did observe though a little loss of sharpness at the extreme edges of the left side only, something that could point to a slightly decentered element or some other similar defect. That loss of sharpness was very little, wouldn't really be observed on practical shooting, and in fact, It would not even show on Super 35 sensors at all since it's out of the image circle. The infinity focus was off as well, something that made me a little suspicious about this lens in general. The lens was sent in mainly for its very stiff focus that it was so hard to turn and made it unusable even for photography. Even during my test, the strain on the lens mount and the camera itself was very high and I was extra careful to avoid any damage. Upon a closer inspection with a strong flashlight, I saw a faint yellow haze with some dust stuck on it, which meant the haze was still wet and therefore cleanable, but also an outline of little dots at one of the doublets. Although I suspected separation, I couldn't be sure unless I checked the doublet by its own. The outline was not symmetric either, so it could potentially be responsible for the loss of sharpness on the left side of the image. Other than that, the lens was generally very clean, with some typical circular marks under the front element and some hairline marks in the back elements, which are quite common with these lenses and not image affecting in any way. Since I have already tested the lens in detail, I knew that it was performing extremely well anyways, short of the little problem at the left side. I unscrewed the front plate using a rubber tool and very carefully lifted it, as it can slide off and scratch the front element. The two holes on the front group are for accessing the front elements, something that we don't need in this case. Instead, the whole front group can be simply unscrewed as well using a rubber tool. Although this is the floating element of the lens, it is designed in a way that precise measurements are not needed before disassembly. I take out the front group very carefully, also making sure the seams that come with it don't get damaged. Those seams make sure that the group is screwed in at the right height for optical performance. Next, I take off the front frame of the lens. A screw accidentally dropping into the lens from this height will guarantee a scratch on the element, so I make sure the iris is closed just in case. I'm using a large and thick screwdriver that I can have a good grip on so I don't damage the thread-locked screws. While having a good grip and putting a controllable power against the lens, I make small attempts to break the thread lock. I don't turn the screwdriver completely till I feel the thread lock was broken and the screw is actually unscrewing. Any kind of screwdrivers with a small grip, even if they are the appropriate kind, will probably result in stripped screws or partially damaged screws. After removing the front frame, you can access the inner part of the lens. You will see something a little unusual here compared to other lenses. There are two small metal plates connecting the back group to the outer helicoid. On the other side, there is the metal frame where the front group was screwed in. So what's going on here? Unlike both the 28mm f2 and 35mm f1.4 Distagons made in the 70s, this lens, which is made in the 90s, has a little more modern design for its floating element group. This design allows the front group to stay at a fixed distance against the camera, while the back group actually moves to perform the focusing function. In other words, the front group floats on top of the back group instead of moving with it, which is the traditional lens focusing design. In order for that to be possible, there is this outer barrel that is fixed on the back side and holds the front group. Meanwhile, the back group is connected to the helicoid with these little metal plates and through the outer frame. There's nothing too complex going on here actually, and the lens is designed in a way that extra marks or measurements are not really required. At this point, I started unscrewing the back part of the lens so I can access the outer frame. After removing the mount and the iris though, I was surprised to find out that the focus was suddenly much lighter. While it was still quite heavy and a cleaning of the helicoid would still be required, that pointed to the mount in some way interfering with the focusing of the lens, something that had to be addressed. I have first tested the iris ring by its own, then the mount by its own, and the focus was still not as heavy as before. When I've put the latex mount on top though, we got back to the previous state with the focus being extremely heavy. Good thing I have a few 21s around, so I could directly test by switching components around. First, I changed only the latex mount and confirmed that the latex mount itself is not the problem. I've also confirmed that when switching with the other lens mount, everything was working correctly, which meant there was no problem in the lens frame. So the conclusion was that the problem was in the lens mount itself. After some careful inspection on the mount, I found out there was indeed a bump that was causing the problem. I have confirmed that with my caliper as well. Of course, this is not something that's easy at all to return to factory state, and extreme care must be taken to make sure the mount is not further damaged. The first thing I tried was to bend it back with my hands, just in case. This is a very strong alloy, of course, and as expected that didn't really work. The next approach was to tap it using a heavy object, in this case a lens vise tool. I have put a thick cloth under it to make sure I don't actually damage the mount. This did a little work, but I soon figured out it wouldn't be enough to fix the problem. I gave it another go using my hands in gloves and a rubber pad to get the best grip possible, but that also did a little change. So I went to the method that I wanted to initially avoid, which is using pliers. The reason I wanted to avoid that is because it's the one with the least control and the one that needs the most care to work with, as the mount can easily be bent in a worse state. I'm also using the thick cloth here to avoid damaging the mount and its paint. I go with very gentle moves, trying to focus the power only at the very specific part and of course not bending the mount in any other place. After several attempts, I got the mount into a very manageable state where I could tighten the latex mount well enough and still have the focus not getting harder. I would apply thread lock on the latex mount screws anyway, so it won't be a problem. How did this bend on the mount happen is a mystery. Perhaps it happened when somebody was trying to open the lens and declick it during the installation of the latex mount by over-tightening the screws, or perhaps it happened during a drop of the lens. In either case, as this lens is pretty expensive, this mount part can be replaced if required with one from a damaged lens. Any Contax version mount of this size would do, and if full functionality for film cameras is required, the inner part can be changed too. I then move on to the optics of the lens. First, I wanted to inspect the back doublet from the front group to see if the circular haze was a result of separation. The front group can be easily unscrewed in two parts. The back part is the one containing both the doublets that often separate and cause most of the problems with this lens. It also has seams to control the distance from the front group when screwed in, so losing these will result into a compromised image. I took out the back doublet and inspected it individually, confirming the separation. Since I have already confirmed during the test that this circular separation and its current state does not have any practical effect to the image, I have recommended to the lens owner to not worry about it at this point. If the separation progresses further, of course, it can be re-cemented. Despite what one might read around the internet, re-cementing doublets is not the hardest job of all, and it can be done successfully with relatively basic equipment, the right chemicals, and of course the correct techniques. For sure, it's not something that people without plenty of servicing experience should even attempt, but at the same time it's not some dreaded unfixable condition. Perhaps I will make a video about this in the future. Meanwhile, if you want to attempt re-cementing a doublet of your lens, make sure an expensive 21mm Contax is not your first. At this point, I have cleaned up the little yellow haze on the back of the front group. I had the lens a little too close to my eyes and the camera missed it, but in general, since the haze was in wet form, I've used several Q-tips and very gently removed the dust and the oil from the element. I've then screwed the front group back and I was done with the optics for this lens, as the back group was already in good state. Next, I will work on cleaning and relubricating the lens focusing helicoid. We'll need to unscrew only the outer two screws from the metal plates that hold the back group to the outer helicoid. A very thin or special shaped screwdriver is required for this job. I'm unscrewing them carefully, making sure I don't put too much pressure on the frame or the focusing ring. The inner screws do not need to be unscrewed. Now, on the back of the lens, I will make a little mark so I know the correct orientation of the outer frame relative to the back frame. Then I will unscrew the 4 screws that hold the outer frame, again using a big thick screwdriver. While on the last screws, I'm holding the back frame so it doesn't fall through. After unscrewing the last screw, I turn the lens and carefully remove the outer frame and the back group assembly. You can also see clearer at this point how the focusing works. The back group, which is connected with the focusing helicoid, moves back and forth, while the outer frame holding the front group stays still. or it's floating if you rather. I'm now left with mechanical parts only, which is the focusing helicoid. This is still quite stiff, so a proper cleaning is required. I carefully take off the rubber from the focusing ring. Then I put the lens at infinity and I make a couple of marks on where the ring that connects the focusing ring with the helicoid is positioned. I'm using some acetons on the screws of the focusing ring to clean up some old thread lock and carefully take the screws off using the big screwdriver, making sure I don't damage any screws. After I take off the focusing ring, I make marks on where the outer and inner helicoids are when at infinity in relation to the witness mark. I also take measurements of both with a caliper just in case. I take out the two helicoid keys so the helicoid system can be decoupled. Then I carefully unscrew the inner helicoid, paying attention where it will come off. I put a mark on the outer helicoid so I know the exact position that the inner helicoid couples in. Then I unscrew the outer helicoid, also making a mark at where it came off in relation to the back barrel of the lens. Now I can start the cleaning of the part. I usually use an ultrasonic cleaner, but in this case the helicoids were already quite clean, so I cleaned them manually. I use lighter fluid and various tools and techniques to make sure all of this old grease is removed. After cleaning, I first check the helicoids without any grease applied so I can feel any remaining grease. When I make sure everything is fine, I apply grease to the helicoids and couple the system together. In this particular lens, I use a lighter grease for the helicoids but a heavier grease for the helicoid keys. I confirm the helicoids are in the right position by measuring with a caliper. I take my time to test the feel of the lens and whether it's tightly put together without any gaps. If there are any gaps here, the focusing can feel clicky and result in image shifts when changing focusing direction. The next step is to put the focusing ring back. First, I put the tightening ring at its previous position and then I screw on the focusing ring. After cleaning the outer frame, I insert it back, making sure it aligns properly with my marks on the back frame. Then I screw it on the focusing helicoid and on the back frame. After making sure everything feels alright, I apply thread lock on the helicoid keys and all the screws. The owner wanted their lens to click, so I apply my iris grease before putting the iris ring back. I then screw on the mount and the latex EF adapter and insert the frame and the front element. Since the lens had the problem with the mount, I wanted to do some tests to make sure everything is alright before I completely seal the lens. I had to readjust infinity on this lens to compensate for the little issue on the mount. After I confirmed everything is good, I came back and sealed the mount, the EF adapter, the front frame and the focusing ring, applying thread lock. I have left the lens alone for 24 hours for the thread lock to cure because otherwise the front element seam rings would touch the wet thread lock on the front frame screws. Finally, I cleaned up any wet thread lock and carefully reattached the front group. This front group can be screwed in a wrong angle, resulting in an incorrect image with blurry edges, so it needs to be made sure it's all the way in properly. Finally, I attached the rubber ring and the front nameplate. Now, this lens is ready to be used for a long time with confidence and without any problems. Thank you so much for watching this video. Always remember to not open up vintage lenses without the proper tools, patience and experience. All this might seem very simple on camera, but this is a very expensive and rare 21mm Contax lens made only in a few thousand copies. It will never be made again and you might be damaging one of the last good ones. Always start with cheaper and easily replaceable lenses and slowly build up your experience from there. Never force anything, never put too much power and never use improper tools or chemicals. Lenses servicing can be very stressful and traumatic to some extent if an expensive and rare lens gets permanently damaged. There are still many great technicians out there that can get your lens in perfect shape without all the stress and worries, so make sure to consider all the options. Have a great day and see you next time.